Thank you for joining to this session on behavioral and experimental approaches on the MDU. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. And we're going to start right on time with, let me just bring up the roster here, with Michael Kemerat, Dave Boating, and Bradley McCoy from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and Association of the Bay Area Governments. So whenever you feel ready, please go ahead. I'll turn off my video, and when you're running out of time, I will appear again on the screen. So that's kind of like the cue for you to finish your presentation. Go ahead, please.
Sounds good. Can you see the screen okay?
We see the screen perfectly.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Michael. I'm here with Raleigh to share how we used games as tools for engaging stakeholders in a 30-year regional scenario planning initiative. We work for the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Bay Area Governments to develop a 30-year roadmap for the future. So we support the region that includes cities like San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, as well as 98 other cities totaling 7.7 million people. Our plan outlines policies for growth and identifies investments. We began our most recent planning effort in 2018 when our region was starting to grapple with uncertainty. The year prior, we lost 10,000 homes in a single wildfire. Our region is one of the major testing beds of autonomous vehicle usage, where we now have vehicles in many cities operating without a safety individual behind the wheel. And our region over the past decade has seen explosive job growth over the past 10 years, vastly outpacing housing 8-to-1. But that was nothing for what 2020 had in store for us and others. Overnight, telecommutes replaced transit and other trips in our region. Brick and mortar stores have closed and e-commerce has exploded. And housing preferences have drastically shifted, with downtown rents dropping 10 to 30%, while many suburban home values have increased. Our shift in long-range regional planning was something that we really noticed that we needed to do when we started our process in 2018. Prior to that, we had a process of trying to predict the future, and now we're much more interested in studying divergent futures and how policies and investments perform under a variety of different conditions, looking for strategies and investments they're going to be most resilient and equitable in a variety of future conditions. Well, obviously, this has been common for many fields for quite some time. This was a new approach for us. And what we feel makes our work most unique is the regional planning application, some of our simulation modeling work. And really our focus today is to talk about the outreach we use to connect our stakeholders to the uncertainty exercise. So our stakeholder engagement directly informed our simulation analytical modeling. And really what we're trying to express here in terms of the timeline of our process is the kind of back and forth between our engagement and then our modeling work. We're representing the work that we completed in 2018 and 2019. Our process for our long range plan has continued throughout 2020 with 2 more rounds of simulation, as well as an additional round of outreach in between. And so we started early on with folks to craft futures for us to study. We then went into our first round of simulation, where we studied how the region and its current policies and strategies performed in a variety of possible future conditions. And then we went back to folks to articulate what we had learned in that analysis to get their input on which strategies and investments we should study in a subsequent round of analysis, which is that second gray box at the bottom. And then we had our first major round where we put the public in the shoes of an elected official trying to make decisions on what would be the best choices for the region. Our goals for engagement was to create a shared ownership over the process, so that at the end we had folks who were bought in to the final product. We wanted to allow engagement to inform our analysis. And to do that, we had to bring people in and have them exposed to the depth of the analysis that we were doing. But we had to do that in a very quick way, because we can't ask folks to spend a week with us to really dig in. We used game mechanics as a way to create deep engagement with people so that we had 100% of their attention. And we used Josh Lerner and his research from almost a decade ago on making democracy fun. And we'll talk about these mechanics as we go through the presentation. So this is the Create a Future exercise. It was the very first engagement we did with stakeholders at the beginning. We invited folks at the city level, the county level, some academics in our region, as well as influential thought leaders, as well as some nonprofits to have a conversation on how could we craft an internally consistent future defined by 24 external forces, things like where might future job centers choose to locate. In groups of 4, folks worked together to define 24 external force assumptions. To ensure that we'd wind up with divergent futures, we actually gave people a board where 2 of those external forces were fixed, and they had to craft an internally consistent future that matched with those 2 elements that we had fixed. At the end of the half day that we spent with folks, we had crafted 12 possible futures, which we later narrowed to 3. And those 24 external forces were then what informed that first round of analysis. They became the inputs for our modeling work. So in terms of the game mechanics that we used vibrant visuals where folks were working with these large boards with infographic style text and colors. Enjoyable core mechanics, just the act of getting to place something and secure it on a board is something that people get kind of a genuine enjoyment out of. Having clear goals and objective by having a board with empty spaces where people knew where they needed to place things, and the game would be, or the exercise rather, would be over when they had kind of assigned an assumption to fill out the board. And then we asked folks to develop a narrative for the future that they had crafted. Was the first exercise, Create a Future. We then went and simulated what those futures would look like for the Bay Area region. And then we went back to folks and said, here's a list of challenges that we've identified. What are the new policies and investments our region might need to consider to address some of these challenges that we've identified for you? So the objective of the exercise was for folks to come up with a set of policies and investments the region should be considering. And to do that, we had groups of 8 get together to solve the challenges in a single future at a time. This was a round-based exercise where folks first identified a key challenge that they wanted to focus on, and then chose from a set of strategies to respond to it. The exercise would then repeat until the funds were spent. And once they had solved or assigned strategies and investments to one future, they'd get up and move to another board, which was laid out the same, the mechanics were the same, but they were solving the unique challenges specific to that future. In the end, with all of the stakeholders that we played with, we had over 40 iterations of gameplay, which provided us great data on which investments and policies we wanted to study. So in terms of the mechanics that we used, again, having very clear goals and objectives is really important for people to get enjoyment out of an exercise. Just-in-time information is a mechanic that we use for a bunch of our work, where folks aren't being just hit with a fire hose of information, but instead you're parsing it into individual elements where they focus on a single challenge, and then maybe a subset of strategies to respond to that rather than every challenge and every possible intervention. Rounds was one way that we accomplished that. Vibrant visuals again, narrative again, having a limited budget put constraint on the exercise. And this is a collaborative game where it's the group working together against the system, or in this case, the future. And as always, having things that people get to place and secure on the board is something that, is just a really inherent way that people get enjoyment out of an exercise. So we then went back and did a whole nother round of modeling where we were exploring how well those new sets of policies and investments performed against the backdrop of each of those 3 futures. And then we went back out for another round of outreach, which Raleigh is going to discuss.
Thank you, Michael. So our third and final exercise that we'll be highlighting in today's presentation followed a second round of modeling analysis work, where the strategies that were prioritized in Transform a Future were tested in the 3 futures constructed in Create a Future. The Mayor of Bayville game was designed to share those results with members of the general public, and more importantly, to gauge public support for the strategies so that we could further narrow down the list of strategies for inclusion in the long-range plan. Mayor of Bayville was structured as a browser-based game available on mobile and desktop. And in the game, the user is cast in the role of the mayor of a fictional Bay Area city called Bayville. Throughout the game, the mayor is presented with information on challenges that the city is facing, as well as potential strategies for tackling those challenges. The mayor then selects from the strategies to craft their plan for the future of the city. And ultimately, the game attracted responses from over 3,000 Bay Area residents, allowing us to identify which strategies were the most exciting to the public. Mayor of Bayville leveraged many of the elements identified by Lerner. Vibrant visuals contributed to an immersive experience, and the game was interactive and spontaneous, with characters like residents and advisors presenting just-in-time information. The goal for the user was simple: to create a plan for the future of the city by selecting from strategies, and the levels were clearly identified to keep the user engaged until the very end. The final element I'll highlight is the resources component, where the mayor had to stay within a budget when selecting from strategies. In summary, stakeholder feedback, both from staff at partner agencies as well as members of the public, was critical in the process of selecting policies and investments for inclusion in the long-range plan. Games like the ones that we highlighted here today were really key in grabbing the attention of our stakeholders and enabling us to communicate information and engage with our stakeholders in a meaningful way. The variety of engagement mechanics that we used enabled us to discuss both how resilient the policies were to uncertainty, as well as what their equity impacts were with those stakeholders. And it helped advance the strategies that had the strongest support. In terms of lessons learned, looking back, the engagement effort for Horizon was lauded by our board as well as our partners as some of the most innovative engagement work that the agency had put forth to date. The use of games was successful in that it provided a bounded mechanism for deep engagement on complex topics and helped to identify where public support existed and where it did not. And ultimately, we were able to reach our goal of arriving at a series of stress-tested policies and investments that ended up being recommended for inclusion in the long-range plan. The challenges we faced were primarily due to the increased level of analytical complexity that came from including 3 potential future scenarios for analysis instead of 1. This stressed our resources and limited our ability to do on-the-fly analyses. And it also made it difficult to strike the right balance in terms of level of detail shared during the engagement, particularly when stakeholders had widely different levels of familiarity with the analyses that had preceded the work they were seeing. In conclusion, if you are interested in learning more, we have a few links for you on the screen, including a link to the final futures report summarizing the analysis and recommendations from our scenario planning work, and a document on the strategies that are currently being studied as we narrow in on our next long-range plan, Plan Bay Area 2050. And that is it.
Thank you very much, Michael and Riley. That was a wonderful presentation. We're gonna wait at the end for the questions. So now we're gonna move to Adrian Vargas and Pablo Ignacio Soto from Tecnológico Monterrey and Norwegian University. So please, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
The project that we're going to present now, it's called Diffusional Responsibility and Social Damage. And this is a joint effort with Adrian Vargas Lopez. He's a PhD candidate at Tecnológico Monterrey, and I'm a PhD research scholar at the Norwegian School of Economics. So this is a behavioral and experimental project. The motivation of our project is that the diffusing moral responsibility could be kind of a self-serving justification, where individuals try to do something that will benefit them, but will generate a social damage. And the idea is that, okay, individuals try to tend to pass the blame of something to others to protect their self-image as ethical beings. An example of this is that we know that in order to prevent global warming, we only need to do very small changes to our lifestyles, but it is very difficult to convince people to do this. And one of the reasons might be because individuals may think that, okay, it's responsibility of corporations, it's responsibility of governments, but it is not their individual responsibility. Or they might also think that their marginal damage that they create by their actions is not big to care. So we kind of formalize these ideas in two main concepts. One concept is the diffusion of responsibility concept. That means that, okay, people don't feel that they are to blame individually when they act in a group. And this is kind of having this an intuition, a moral intuition about blame being something that you can divide. So we all, or I think that we all have the intuition that it is not, or it does not feel the same to steal $10 alone than to steal $10 with a friend, or even to steal $10 with 50 other friends. So if you steal $10 with 50 other friends, then you don't feel as guilty as if you steal $10 alone. But of course, that is like a philosophical assumption that we cannot prove. And at the same time, we also have this idea of the pivotality aversion. That is something that others have researched about. And it is the idea that individuals in a group perceive that it is unlikely that their moral actions will be decisive. We can think about this, for example, in voting. People tend to think that it is not their vote the one that will change an election or will decide an election, but we know that in every election, there's always someone who is the first who votes after getting a majority, right? So with this, we generate two research questions. The first is, how the size of a group and being or not pivotal affect this phenomenon of diffusion of moral responsibility. This is how the size of the group and the being or not decisive change how people feel guilty about doing something unethical in a group. In our project, this can be understood as how the size of the group and being or not pivotal affect the probability that an individual will accept or not a deal that I will explain later which kind of deal is this, that will give them a small private benefit, but with negative consequences for society. Our project is related to literature in psychology that has explored something that is called the bystander effect. And this is the phenomenon that explains why people behave differently in emergencies when they are alone than when they are with other people. It is observed that when people face emergencies with other people, they tend to act less because they feel that, okay, it's other people's responsibility, it's not theirs. And also in experimental economics, it is observed this delegation of unpopular choices in, for example, dictator games or trust games. There are some individuals who are willing to pay others to make choices that otherwise would make them seem selfish or unethical. And critically, our paper is very close to one that was published last year at the Review of Economic Studies by Falk and Zek, where they observed and they explored this idea of pivotality aversion in a quite complicated and a bit cool experiment. But the problem with that experiment is that it was very complicated and they had to kill some mice in the process. So our main contribution is that we add to the literature this idea of how the size of the group affects the phenomenon of diffusion responsibility and pivotality aversion. And we also explore some mechanisms for this. Also, we understand pivotality in a different way and complementary way than Falk and Zek. And we simplify the experimental design because in our experiments, we don't kill any animal. And it's much more simpler. We do it in a survey. And finally, we propose a game theoretical model to derive our hypothesis. In these presentations, we are not going to focus on the theoretical model, but you can read about it in our working paper. To the decision-making under deep uncertainty literature, we are simply stating that in many global problems, individuals make moral choices in a deep uncertainty sort of situation because, for example, with regard to global warming, we don't really know what the size of the problem is. We have some calculations, but we don't know how society will be affected in the end. We also don't know what's the weight of marginal actions on this. And it is not always clear who are the players. So individuals need to make some choices in a situation that they definitely know very little about. And also, if diffusion of responsibility and pivotality aversion are relevant, then these phenomena should be considered in theoretical models and simulations that analyze this kind of group choices. So as I said, our experiment happened in a survey that was distributed in 2 universities in Mexico City, to bachelor and master's students, one private and one public university. And these students were randomized into groups. Afterwards, they were offered a deal that I will explain in the following section. And then we asked 3 questionnaires. One, it was about the mechanisms. So it was about the beliefs, their beliefs about the behavior of others, the typical socioeconomic questions, and one questionnaire about environmental behavior in general, particularly waste behavior. And finally, we did some payments and the donations that we promised. So, but what was this deal about? The deal was about, we offered the participants to increase their probability, actually to duplicate their probability of winning 600 pesos in a raffle. 600 pesos is roughly 6 days of minimum wage in Mexico City. So we offer them, you can increase your probability of winning this money, but if you accept duplicating your probability, then you are contributing to destroy 400 Mexican pesos donation to a reforestation effort in the platform Think Trees. And 400 Mexican pesos is enough to plant around 20 trees in this platform. So that's the tension. They need to decide if go for the money for themselves, but the cost of going for money for themselves is contributing to this generation of social damage in the way understood as destroying, helping to destroy the environment. So you can think about it like in this way. So if this is, I mean, if we represent like this all the participants, so in a group, so this is the size of the group. One of our groups, for example, had 400 participants. We tell them that, okay, there are 400 participants, but if 25 of them, there's a limit. If 25 of them accept the deal, then we will destroy the donation. So for example, if only 10 participants accept the deal, we don't destroy the donation and we make the donation. But if more than 25 of them accept the deal, then we would destroy the donation and we don't do it. And to some of them, we tell them that it might be the case that they are the pivotal player. So we tell them like, okay, if you accept, for sure, we will destroy the donation. Of course, it is not like this player is more guilty or less guilty. It is just like, okay, we tell he or she knows that if he or she accepts, the donation will be destroyed, but of course, someone else could accept as well. And because of this, there are 2 types of non-pivotal individuals. The first type is the individuals that know that, okay, maybe I can accept the deal, but someone else in the future might accept it as well, and then the donation is destroyed. But the other type of non-pivotal individual is the type that was explored by Falkensack, and it's the type of individuals who know that, okay, the damage is already done. So if I accept the deal, it's not a problem anymore, right? So if, for example, if we knew that the environment is already ruined, then it would be not a hard moral to pollute a little bit more, right? So our experiment is a 2x2 factorial design within a survey. And it is important to say that participants are not interacting simultaneously. So later on, we build these groups. And the first factor is the size of the group. The size of the large group was, as I said, 400. And the limit before destroying the donation was 25. And the non-pivotal individuals, we told them like it might be possible that 20 individuals already accepted the deal. And for the small group, it worked very similarly. So the size, it was 100 and the limit was 10. So in a way, the small group had to decide if to share the blame with 10 other players. And in the big group, they were deciding if to share the blame with 25. Our hypothesis that we must say that we pre-registered them in as predicted, so we could not change them afterwards. First of all, it is the diffusion of responsibility hypothesis. That meant like in large groups, more people will accept the deal. The pivotality aversion hypothesis, that more non-pivotal individuals will accept the deal. And then as a consequence, that the small group final person, the small group pivotal experimental group would be the one that would accept less the deal, because they are the ones who know that they cannot diffuse the responsibility so much. So if they do something bad, they have to take the blame. And the group that would accept the deal the most would be the group number B, where they can share the blame with many other players, and they know that they are not the pivotal. This is what players read. I'm not going to read it now, but just to say that, okay, we were only changing the part where we said about the size of the group and if the pivotality. This is, of course, a translation. We checked first that our experimental groups were balanced across some socioeconomic variables like age, gender, family size, financial aid, and an index that we made to check about their relation to the environment. So groups were balanced. And this is our interesting graph, and the graph that made us happy, because at least here qualitatively it is very beautifully seen that our hypotheses are on track, because it is true that the small pivotal group, in the small pivotal group, it was the group where the least number of participants accepted the deal. There only 32% of participants accepted the deal, but in the big not pivotal group, almost half of them accepted the deal. So this is kind of an indication that it is true that individuals feel that they can kind of divide their blame. It is important to say that the difference between these two groups is statistically significant. However, between the groups small not pivotal and big pivotal, that difference, it is not statistically significant, but at least qualitatively it is interesting to see, and that kind of excites us to go further with the project. So we also checked this with this econometric model, where we had some dichotomic variables for the conditions, for the small condition, for the pivotal condition, and we had two sets of controls. The first set of controls had to do with beliefs, the mechanisms that we checked, beliefs about the behavior of others, and the other set of controls had to do with socioeconomic variables. The main result is that we find a barely statistical significant difference between the small and big condition, and this makes us think that the group size is relevant. So smaller groups accepted the deal less, and we observe that a non-statistical significant difference between the pivotal and not pivotal, but the difference is at least in the expected direction. So later on, in a deeper analysis of our data set, we observed that, okay, this difference, maybe our pivotal condition was not credible. So just to go quickly to the next steps. Yeah, adding the interaction between size of the group and pivotality does not change as much. So yeah, finally, we checked these other mechanisms that, as I said, have to do with their beliefs about the behavior of others.
Just actually touch the arm of.
Yeah, yeah, sorry, someone, yeah. Had to do their beliefs about the behavior of others, but that does not change anything. So we really think that the only thing that was moving there was the diffusion of responsibility. So
Sigurdsson for another 100.
yeah, I don't know, some sound there, yeah. But simply the next step is to design and conduct a synchronous experiment with a higher monetary incentive, not with a raffle, but with direct money, a bigger sample, and a more credible pivotal condition. And finish the formalization of the theoretical model that frames the situation in a more generalizable way and derive and present public policy implications. So, well, thank you very much for your comments, questions, and feedback at our emails. It will be very interesting to read your thoughts about this.
Right on time.
Yeah.
So now we'll leave questions at the end. Now we'll from
yeah, perfect.
The National University.
So questions at the end. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Maybe it's good morning in other places of the world, but here in Mexico it's the evening. So today I'm very happy I will be sharing with you our results of this effort that is taking place at LANSYS, and I'm going to present this capacity building program for the MDU. And well, I work at the Laboratory of Sustainability Sciences at the Institute of Ecology, which is part of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. So sustainability problems are characterized by being very complex and deeply uncertain, and not only about the things we know we don't know, but also about all the features and mechanisms and processes that we don't know, that are still unknown. And sustainability problems, they involve diversity of values and ideologies, which manifest themselves as narratives that reflect specialized knowledge, frameworks, and perspectives. And usually these sustainability problems are embedded within a specific sociopolitical context. And one of the main things about sustainability problems is that this uncertainty is, that means that there's no one solution or one only mechanism to address sustainability problems. And usually this requires transformative change at multiple scales. So transdisciplinary research is a way forward to address sustainability problems. And in order to produce reliable and legitimate knowledge, research has to reflect the diversity and complexity and dynamics of the related problems. And with diversity, diversity has to do with all the variety of knowledge dimensions which are related to different disciplines and and this pluralism of different values and norms, which are not exactly or might not be fit in a systematic way. The complexity is related to all the interdynamics and interrelations of the different knowledge dimensions. And finally, the dynamics with that incorporate all the changes of these dimensions that act together over time. So transdisciplinary research aims to bridge the gap between different and opposing narratives, and therefore it facilitates mutual learning between science and society. It also helps mobilizing stakeholders and building networks through learning, that foster learning and transformation. So transdisciplinary research aims to enhance credibility and legitimacy of knowledge. So in this figure, what is shown is the development of a transdisciplinary process. So in step one, the different members of the scientific or practitioner community, they recognize common interest in a particular complex phenomenon. So in this step, there is acknowledgement that bringing together different perspectives and approaches that will be beneficial to understand the complexity of the related phenomenon or problem. So in the step two, this is where the partnership is built, and this may include an agreement to launch different workshops or learning forums. And it's important here because there is the scientific community, well, the scientific and the practitioners, they take co-responsibility and co-leadership in facilitating the process. So in this point three, this is where there should be an agreement between the stakeholders, the representatives of all the stakeholders, in the sense of guiding or defining a guiding question, defining the system boundaries, the time frame, and other key aspects of the process. And finally, in the last part of this transdisciplinary process, there is the post-processing takes place until the legitimized knowledge is co-produced. So what we can see, this is a very systematic process, a systematic way in which all the different perspectives and different views are made visible. So decision-making for deep uncertainty is a promising framework for sustainability. Why? Because it helps navigating and embracing uncertainty by designing flexible, transparent, and robust strategies. So therefore, it is essential to build capacities in the context of sustainable development to promote multi-stakeholder engagement and participation. However, this poses important challenges, being a prominent one, the principle of collaboration in policymaking. So in this sense, universities play an essential role in building such capacities. So the idea of the capacity building program for the MDU is that the framework will allow or will train objective groups to understand and to identify the present circumstances that could lead or that might lead to both unsustainable and sustainable future scenarios, and to identify intervention points that could lead to design together different strategies that enable to transition to a sustainable future. So this is the main point of the capacity building approach, to make conscious, to make the stakeholders conscious, or to reflect on their needs or their values and their norms that could lead to different future scenarios. So the approach for the capacity building program, well, it aims to incorporate the MDU principles, methods, and tools to develop essential competencies for effective multi-stakeholder engagement. So it is organized in 4 domains: the thematic, the procedural, the technical, and the evaluative domains, and include 5 objective groups: the civil society, the stakeholder representatives, the government agencies, and finally, the graduate students. So the thematic domain involves the variety of thematic areas of sustainable development, that from land use, environmental protection, water governance, partnerships, poverty reduction, equality. The procedural dimension deals with the governance system, which is related to all the international and national regulatory bodies that promote policy coherence among different government agencies and departments. The technical domain is related to the design of analytical tools for decision making that promote or that help to synthesize, to integrate, and to translate the co-produced knowledge. And finally, the evaluative domain which deals with the epistemological pluralism, which is inherent to the transdisciplinary research. So as part of the implementation of our approach, in 2018, through a university partnership between UNAM and the Arizona State University, the Binational Laboratory on Sustainability, Vulnerability, and Adaptation to Climate Change was created. So as part of the activities of SBAC, we carry out a collaborative planning framework for ecological ordinance in coastal Yucatan, Mexico. And so in Mexico, collaborative planning is mainly implemented through a policy instrument, which is called ecological ordinance. And ecological ordinance entails 4 stages. The first one is the characterization of the socio-ecological system. Then comes the diagnosis of the drivers, the mechanisms of change, and the main environmental conflicts. Then there's the prognosis, the prognosis of future scenarios, and finally there's the last stage of the process is the legally binding zoning proposal. So in 2000, as part of the SBAC activities, we conducted different technical training sessions that involve the use of different geospatial and analytical tools. And also we carry out the participatory workshops that help stakeholders reflect on their needs, their values, and motivations. So as part of our results, we organized this capacity building program in terms of how it relates to each of our objective groups. So for the tier 1, which is the civil society, their activities need to focus on the need to understand the basic principles of the MDU, to distinguish the collaborative process as a democratic tool, and to identify the public participation spaces for decision making. The tier 2, which is the stakeholder representatives, it addresses the needs of stakeholder representatives, which is directed to understand and analyze the basic principles of the MDU, to comprehend the basic principles of collaborative planning, and to integrate co-produced knowledge. And finally, in this complexity scope, the tier 3, which focuses on knowledge and skills that are directed to authorities in order to understand, to analyze, and to communicate the basic principles of the MDU, as well as analyze information and design strategies. So these 3 levels of capacities, they provide a platform to strengthen the MDU capacities through collaboration and engagement. So in terms of the training, the non-formal and formal education programs, we divided it in the non-formal and the formal. The non-formal will be directed to the civil society, to the stakeholder representatives, and also to government agencies. And the formal one to the teaching demands of the master and doctorate students, in this particular case, in the Sustainability Science graduate program. The non-formal education program, its main objective is to foster collaborative work and democracy through having a civil society participation. And in terms of the formal training, it implies a profound transformation that could enable the emergence of different teaching and learning paradigms. So in terms of the specific capacities that we identify, so the first one of the most interesting results that when we implemented this approach is that we observe different levels of resistance to change and also different levels of collaboration. So the first capacity was that we identified was conflict resolution and negotiation. And this is directed to the civil society and also to the authorities, and to 2 different domains, which is the evaluative and the procedural dimension. Another capacity is the engagement in participatory mechanisms and the facilitation skills, which is aimed at civil society, authorities, and stakeholder representatives. Another important capacity that needs to be strengthened is building trust and communication. So in this particular case, collaboration is not something that comes organically. I mean, we need to learn to collaborate while collaborating. So this is a continuous process that is aimed at stakeholder representatives. And also we identify another capacity, which is related to the technological certifications associated to the civil society and authorities. So in a more technical kind of skill, we have data collection and knowledge integration. Other modeling techniques that are directed to the stakeholder representatives, scenario building, visualization of process information, and development of training courses. So just to conclude, what some of the lessons that this exercise put in evidence is that capacity building should be developed taking into account the regional socio-political context. That also the effective implementation of capacity building must be tailored to the different roles and functions of the actors involved in collaborative planning. Our fourth domain scheme provides flexibility, enough flexibility to build up capacities that can be continuously adapted. And finally, not most importantly, but I think this is a big reflection, is that this capacity building, of course, it aims to train for acquiring knowledge, but also it aims to develop critical consciousness that allows evaluating values and attitudes that induce favorable changes towards sustainability. So some of the ongoing work, well, right now we're working on the development of a course syllabus to be incorporated into the Sustainability Science Graduate Program at the UNAM. And also we want to work on applying different transdisciplinary tools and to adapt them to this online normality that could be used for the MDU capacity building and citizen engagement. So I want to also acknowledge the support of all the team at LANCYS during the participatory workshops, the training and the seminars, and also some of the funders, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, the PAPIT Fund, the CONACYT, and well, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasune. And thank you to all of you for your great presentations. Now we will open up for questions. If you want to ask a question, I see we don't have a lot of activity in the chat, but if you want to ask a question, you can just unmute yourselves and ask your questions to the presenter. Well, you know, everyone gets ready for that. Michael Riley, your work was very interesting, and you know, like how you use games for, you know, both, you know, kind of like understanding what are the needed modeling inputs and, you know, engaging with the community. Two questions about that. Do you use any systematic approach for, you know, processing the engagements? I mean, you engage with the community, they play the games. Is there a way, like a survey or video or analysis that you do that, you know, kind of like systematically can be used, you know, to inform the work of the modelers? And the other question that I had was, you know, have you thought about this phenomenon of cognitive overloading when playing the games? Do you have to you know, train the participants a little bit before? Do you do any experimental control over that? Just a couple of questions just to get us started.
Okay, great. I'll start off, and Raleigh, please jump in as well. In terms of, you know, how did we make decisions with the information that we were receiving, I would say what we've highlighted today were two exercises that were focused. The first two were on kind of our professionals, other city planners, folks who are kind of in the know and could understand a lot of the detail and analysis. Each time we did that round of analysis, we would also have a more simplified version where we'd go out to the public, and then we'd also lead more focus group type discussions with community-based organizations, with communities that generally aren't typically heard when we go out and talk to communities. And we would tally kind of the feedback that we got, knowing kind of the decisions that we had to make on kind of what the external forces would be to define each future, or which investments or policies to study. And I think, you know, in the end, we were very fortunate in that there were very rare instances where there was not consistency across groups. And it was very clear kind of a top tier of ideas or policies that people thought would be most effective. And so we didn't have to grapple too hard with decisions, because there was a lot of agreement that we were seeing from different groups, but knowing that we were kind of segmenting across kind of professionals, the public, and then disadvantaged communities in our region was helpful to understand who was sharing the input, and then also being able to reach so many people, thousands of people in the public at each round, and then also getting to iterate with kind of our peers and getting them to spend an entire day with us. I would say what was really powerful about the games is when we were working with people, they were 100% focused. And so because we had invested so much into the design of the exercise, they were there, they were engaged, they were absorbing a lot of information really quickly. And so we felt really confident that the decisions they were making were informed by a lot of background and analysis. And so that was the power of the game, is it grabbed people's attention and they were very focused and thoughtful in their feedback. Raleigh, do you want to add anything?
Sure. On the topic of cognitive overload, that was also something that was really critical when we were thinking about the design. And whenever we were developing all three of the outreach products that we covered today, we tested them out with people who weren't familiar with the process, and we were able to adapt and cut overly complicated elements so that it was really as simple as possible. And for example, one interaction could have been between 5 and 20 minutes. So trying to design for as quick of an interaction as possible. In the chat too, I'm seeing some questions about recruiting. I'll speak a little bit to the Mayor of Bayville game, which was general public facing, and then Michael can speak a little bit about the participants in the first two exercises. But one of the key demographics that we were hoping to target, who had historically not been involved in giving input on the long range plan, was young people. And we really invested time and resources in reaching out to younger people. There was a paid social media campaign. So we were able to really target that group who are going to inherit the Bay Area of 2050 that we were planning for, but maybe hadn't historically participated. And that was important.
Thank you very
I'll
much.
just quickly say that for some of our stakeholder events, we did try to get people who attended the first one to come back because there was so much knowledge that was built in individuals that were there with us for each stage. And then we also, asked people who were coming into the process midway through to, do homework ahead of time when we were doing some of these larger stakeholder-driven exercises. And then I would say the just-in-time information was really helpful, where they didn't have to receive everything at once, but rather it was in little packets of information throughout the exercise.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Yosune from Patrick Reed. How do you sustain the time and focus commitments of your participants? Also, how do you help them understand the broader efforts and scope?
Yes, that's a very good question. And well, what we found, but what we observed is that the engagement was intermittent. I mean, sometimes they were more engaged than others. And so I suppose this is a normal part of the process. But the use of different boundary objects, that's actually the term, that can be the use of maps, different the platform that they could interact with, could help to maintain a continual engagement. And how do you help them understand the broader effort scope? Well, I suppose that's also something that is built throughout the process. And I mean, it can change. I mean, from at the beginning, they can understand some aspects, and when you go deeper into the transdisciplinary process, they might be able to understand other aspects or manage to do it by themselves. So actually, that triggers learning. So.
Thank you, Yosune. I'm gonna direct one question to Pablo and Adrian. Your experiment actually was very, of course, there's, issues with sample selection and so on, but, for the sake of this session, I was thinking, have you thought about how could you experimentally assess how people make decisions, on their ambiguity, and perhaps, for example, looking at some of the instruments presented by Michael or Raleigh today, or even Yosune's plan for education. I mean, what comes to mind in terms of, you as an experimentalist, how could you study the, design and effectiveness of those products?
Do you want to start, Adrian? Or?
Yes, so what I was thinking is that mainly on what Michael and Raleigh presented, and what Raleigh specifically talked was on the design of the materials, right? So when we think about decision making, I think that designing those materials, testing those materials before the session is critical, because once you're there, you're already there, and they need to pay attention. And so regarding trying to make a connection between our research and their more practical focus, I would say that and also on what Yosune was talking about, having them being engaged for a whole session, having more personal items to look at, so the materials that the facilitators prepare is very important, so they don't diffuse their responsibility on the group, and they make and they think their decisions at that moment and become aware of what is going on, and keep on participating on the session. I think that's critical to have a deep thought of designing the materials beforehand, and to try to have that ready before any session is I think more the most important thing, the most important aspect. And so trying to bring that thought into your question, Edmundo, I think that a more experimental approach would be to actually test those materials, right? So I would say that just to test those materials and become aware of the cognitive overload of participants, and to be aware when they are overload, and to have the materials very very clear to them, and the design and all of those things could be eventually tested and retested, and have an iteration of tests, so that the materials are very, very clear to the participants.
Thank you, Adrian.
Yeah, maybe
I have to stop there.
So maybe adding
Okay.
what you said. Yeah, as Adrian just said, and what I also think it is that our experimental approach, is maybe one step before what Raleigh and Michael are doing, because it is like, okay, in our experiment, we are testing a very kind of basic behavior, and we are trying to observe it even in a very abstract, you could say, unrealistic situation, right? Because it's not like someone in the street is asking you this kind of questions. So because what we're interested about is like this very basic way of understanding a moral concept. So I think that after this stage, this experimental stage, what you are doing is very important, because then if you know that diffusion responsibility happens, and if you know that bilaterality aversion happens, then in the games that you are designing in order to simulate or to see a much more realistic scenario, then you can add up these phenomena. So I would say like it is kind of a first stage, very abstract, very experimental type of study, and then in a second stage, what they are doing. That's how I see it.
Pablo. This is a fascinating discussion, and my apologies that we need to finish now because the panel is about to start. Thank you very much, Pablo. Adrian, there are some questions on the chat. I'll make sure you get them, and so you can answer by email. And thank you.
Yeah, we can answer by email. Thank you very much for the questions.
See you in a little bit.
Thank you.